Hey, Jackie.
Hey, Sean, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. The recording had already started. So.
Alrighty, so I wanted to start a discussion on a thing called group releases. So in the first MVC, I had this thought that we would just enable users in their planning of releases by leveraging group milestones. So that's what we have scheduled in the next couple of milestones, is to support the association of a project release tag to a group milestone. But then, Nathan, you brought up this greater question archetype about actually having an object at the group level that is a release. I would love to hear a little bit more about that. I created an epic, and Hyana added a bunch of sub issues based off of supporting releases association to a group milestone. But I think in theory, we could break the association of a tag from a project release and move it up to the group level and have that object shared, but would love to hear more about what you were thinking, Nathan. Or not. It's okay.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry.
I realized Wi-Fi is really bad on my deck, so that was not as practical as I thought it would be. Yeah, so I hadn't given this a lot of thought before I made that comment, so I don't necessarily want to come across as saying like this is something we should be doing. Sorry, am I frozen?
You were fine. Now you're frozen.
I think I might be frozen.
No, I can hear you fine. Maybe we're frozen on his side.
I can hear you.
Okay, I kind of heard you back. Okay,
You're good? Okay.
What I was saying is I haven't really given this a lot of thought, so this might not make sense to have a group level release. Shoot, unstable again. Sorry about
No,
this.
don't worry. And I think there is a use case that we do want releases at the group level so that there's one tag or one object that can be shared across multiple projects. I think that does exist. That use case does exist.
Are you still there, Nathan? Okay, well, maybe
Sorry.
I'll put my two. Oh, no, go ahead, Nathan. Sorry.
I'm really cutting out bad. Let me try. I'm going to exit and rejoin.
Okay. Go for it, Sean. Maybe while you're here, we can kind of brainstorm on this.
Okay, so I guess, first of all, it sounds like an awesome feature. And I'm also kind of looking at it from the point of view of, do we somehow connect it with multi-project pipelines?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what we're doing, right? We're grouping projects under a release, and so I guess the way I would see it, and this could be totally off base, but just from what I've read, is that okay? So current state is that we have a release, and a release is synonymous with a tag, right? At the moment, and we've talked about splitting that out, which we can of course do. And so then I guess we would have to first, I think, do that first. Maybe I'll just repeat now that Nathan's come back.
Well, I have one thing to say about the fracture of a tag from a release.
Yeah.
So Nathan, Sean was just talking about his 2 cents on it being a good feature. We're supporting of sharing this object across multiple projects to complement things like multi-project pipelines, right? There's a lot of archetypes that show we need to do things across multiple projects. And what we call it at GitLab is supporting at the group level. But when I did this huge validation around multi-project things, people are testing across projects, people are needing to uphold certain compliance requirements across projects. There's a bunch of stuff across projects. So there's definitely a use case for that. And it comes down to, do we want to break up the tag and the release relationship? And
right.
That's where
But Nathan, do you want to now that your your Wi-Fi is going, do you want perhaps you should start again? Maybe you would like to just tell us your thoughts.
Yeah. So my one thought is, if this is something we wanted to support, like a group level release, which I kind of think it could be a neat idea, I think Sean, you had made a comment about like being able to coordinate releases across projects is something
Yep.
that would make sense, which it makes sense to me. Like even at GitLab, we have a lot of different projects like the runner and the main repo
Exactly.
and stuff.
Yep.
So it'd be good to be able to sync all those into one cadence. If we did want to do something like that, maybe it would make sense just to slightly modify the release page for the group page and allow you to associate multiple tags with a single release, specifically one tag per project.
Yep.
And then you can kind of like snapshot across several projects, and that group release could kind of be that way to sync up.
I love that
That's
idea.
one idea.
And I remember, Sean, you made a comment about the idea that I had about calling it a version or something different. So like creating a fracture of what we call a release candidate at the project level and what we call something at the group. So when we look at a release manager, they are often coordinating an end production state for a customer. They're not necessarily looking at like one microservice being promoted to an environment. That's like usually the build manager's job, or even like a development team lead, or even a developer just pushing to a production state, right? So I'm trying to think of a way to create a relationship without calling it a group release, because I'm not sure if that would be, if it's going to behave the exact same way as a project release. Because what you just said, Nathan, like associating multiple tags per project, really we're creating a release bundle.
Exactly. Yeah.
Level.
Well, so there's a few things. So I'm getting I'm thinking through what would be required at the back end, and there will be probably quite a bit, but that's not, you know, any reason to not do this, of course. So, you know, in our current state, you know, release is the same thing as a tag, or but not the same thing, but they are connected, right, one to one. So we would have to potentially break that apart. Well, let's call them project release and group release, even though I know we're not going to actually call them those two different things, just to differentiate. Because so you mentioned version, Jackie. And so I think, you know, maybe we would have to have a different, but there's two ways of doing it, right? We can split the release object out of project altogether and then associate it back to project and associate it to group. That's one way of doing it. Or we could have this kind of like second object, you know, version or group release, or we could just call it release even, which is up at the group level, which is actually independent of the one at the project level. I think that would probably be the least painful way forward. Although, I mean, I think we probably should do a research issue on this, because if we look at the example of GitLab, so, you know, we release 13.2, for example, but in fact, what that actually refers to is the version of the Rails application, whereas the versions of the other applications are all different version numbers, and maybe they don't even get a bump in a particular release. They might just, you know, it's possible that nothing happens to one of the component, you know, the release of CLI, for example, maybe we don't do anything to it in the next version. And so then, you know, then you need some way to have this overarching view. This is 13.2, which happens to be 13.2 of the Rails app, and it's also whatever other versions of the other components, which or sub-projects.
The visual that you're talking about right there is what I consider to be accomplished by this idea of a project milestone and a group milestone. So for users who, like us, who have released CLI, we have a version .10 at the project milestone level, and then at the group milestone level, it's associated with 13.3.
I see. Okay.
So this is where like the beauty of milestones, and if you're using them, you can classify your releases with milestones. We don't need to duplicate the planning functionality, because we're going to seat planning functionality in the milestones. But then there's this actual, say that we have a machine that's triggering releases, and we want to create like a cascade of events after that in the YAML file with automation. Tags are going to be more useful than the milestones, because those are like actions of releases rather than like a runbook, I'm thinking, than a planning series, right? So planning will be milestones. Everything else will be, you know, like any actions we're expecting to be conducted from the deployment should be on the tag. but I don't think we should worry about group releases needing to support planning, because that's what the milestones are going to do, in short.
Okay.
What I'm trying to say.
Okay, now that's great information actually. So when we say release, a release is it's usually it's a code bundle, right? So it's usually a deployment, although not necessarily.
I would say every time I validated this with the customer, they are most likely calling a release candidate a deployment.
Okay.
And they would use a tag to indicate a pre-release, and then they would go through a validation for a production release on that tag and convert it to a release tag. So that's the most common use case I've heard people using. And this is even people who are using GitHub, not just GitLab. So they have a release version that they're considering, they go through some validation checks on it, they take that tagged code and then they convert it to a release candidate or branch, and then they cut that branch to production, right?
Okay, so if we were, coding all this from now and we hadn't got their history in our application, does it make more sense then to just basically have an independent release object that is connected to a group or to a project, or do we want to have two separate objects at one of the group level, one of the release level? Sorry, about the project level.
So here's what my initial gut reaction is. I would love them to be connected and tethered together somehow in a way that, let's say, we have a project release and a user is creating that project release, and then all of a sudden they realize they have microservices or a mobile app that they want to associate to that particular release version. Then they would want to potentially promote that release at the project level to a group to contain all of these ancillary functionalities that will be released to production at the same time.
So I'm just thinking through the promotion. So what would happen in a promotion?
Kind of like how we promote labels, like project labels to group labels. I could see them going into the application, looking at their project page and being like, oh, this web app is actually going to get released to our customers alongside a mobile app, alongside microservices updates, alongside other applications. So I want to promote this. This is like a super think big concept. So I just wanted to throw that idea out there, that customers that I'm talking to that use project releases or use GitHub releases are having a problem connecting related components together that are going to make up a production state for a customer. And we need to solve that. And if we don't have group releases related to project releases and they're separate entities, I don't think that will help people plan and orchestrate and execute production states for their customers. But okay. I'm open. If people think that technically these can be separate and they don't have to live in the same worlds or tables, I just wanted to give you a use case where I could see we want them to be related so that we can create like an escalation path. And if they're not related, then there couldn't be an escalation path because they're two separate objects.
I think we should actually take a look at how labels are implemented, because it does sound quite similar, and there's probably some learnings we can follow there.
And it's a normal pattern
the issue would be that they get disconnected. Well,
think about group and project milestones too. So you have to create a group milestone at the group level, but then you can promote a project milestone to a group milestone. So there's this natural pattern in GitLab of promotion between projects and groups. So
but when you do that, what happens at the project level? It leaves the project, does it, and goes to the group?
Yeah, but all the things that are assigned to that are still assigned to it. Yeah, they're still.
Okay, well that makes sense. So in that case, so if we follow that model, then we do have two objects. We have a group level, but then we have a path to push it up and everything associates with it all the way up. Sounds like fun. But there will be code. But I guess we do need to, as a prerequisite, break out the tag, right?
Yeah, it seems like that would be a requirement, or at least to change it from a single association to a multiple association.
Yeah, I wonder if that would be the first chip away at this. My anxiety is that people are just going to create a bunch of releases without anything attached to it, and then there's just a bunch of like clutter on the releases page that aren't tied to production states or aren't tied to the code. And although there is a use case to support non-code releases, kind of. I just said that and I was like, I don't even think that's true, because because I think like even if they're a bucket, they're still attached to an asset that's linked to somewhere else. So for example, the use case that I've discovered, because we have limitations with our relationships to binaries and relationships to assets, is that users are publishing a release off of a commit from the API that says generate this release tag, and then they link an asset to an external repository or to an external package manager, or even to our package manager, saying this is the version you should be consuming off of infrastructure as code, or if you're a software development team, this is the build we want you to use, like the inner sourcing use case. But it's still attached to code. It still represents like, this is my version of my production state, and here's my link to my binary that I want you to use. So I think that there is this, like, if we break this relationship in totality, I feel like we would create confusion. People would create releases without relationships to the code. So I do firmly believe that there's the multi-select is probably our better option. But then we have this whole like upcoming release thing that we need to support. So maybe there's got to be like a different way to support
because
that.
at the group level, how do we associate it back to the code in the projects? We have to have multiple associations, right?
Right. That's what Nathan was saying, is that we would allow them to populate multiple tags.
Yeah, so we're back to we would use tags, right? Or yeah, okay.
Yeah, the only use case I can think of that you wouldn't want to tag associate is upcoming releases. Other than that, I think it always makes sense to have a tag associated. But that being said, we could break, on a technical side, we could break that requirement, but then in the application itself, we could always require it as part of our workflows. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we would allow people to create a release without a tag, even if in the back end that relationship was broken.
Because I thought in an earlier conversation we were talking about, and I've got to say I was always a little bit confused why we were doing this, but that we would create releases without a tag.
Well, that was for the upcoming releases. That was the only use case that we were trying to support, is that people are using the release object to do a bunch of pre-planning, and then they would cut their release and associate the tag after the deployment.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that makes more sense, because it's basically like a draft, right? Like it's not completed yet.
And maybe that's what we should call them, or maybe that's what it is. Is that
I think GitHub has draft. Yeah.
But we can still call them upcoming releases.
Upcoming's fine, I think. Yeah.
Maybe there's some other things that we can signal inside the UI that says it still needs a tag, or like, warning, this doesn't have a tag on it. Like, maybe there's something that we can, the call to action is if it's an upcoming release, it needs to eventually have a tag on it. And maybe there's rules that we can create that say, hey, delete this release after 30 days if there's no tag associated to it, or whatever date frame makes sense. We can validate that, but that might be an option, because I don't want there to be just a bunch of orphan releases out there with no tags.
Yeah, and just for context on the naming for upcoming releases, we did research on that, and I think in the beginning was I'm not sure if it was draft releases or whatever, it was a different name, and there was some confusion around that. I'm going to find this issue and to get
Around draft.
Yeah.
So that's why we decided not to use draft.
Yeah, we used something, I don't remember exactly, but it was a different name. Draft upcoming and whatever. I'm gonna find out.
Pre-release.
Was it-
Pre-release was the other one, Hannah.
Pre-release, yeah. I can see why that would
Yeah.
be a bit confusing, actually.
Those all can mean slightly different things.
Yeah.
And I remember whenever I first joined, Jason and I had this conversation about upcoming releases. And as somebody who used to orchestrate releases across multiple teams and projects, I know for a fact that having a tool that allows you to kind of forecast or contain all of your objects into one place is helpful, you know?
Yeah.
And then being able to later associate what your production state is exactly what Zevia Labs lets you do, right? There's a thing called a deployment plan that you have a bunch of tasks that are associated to your release activities that are conducted on X date, but all that stuff is pre the X date. So being able to have something that represents those activities up until that point is kind of what, that's the only use case we have for having a release without a tag.
Yeah, and so I guess for an upcoming release, if it needed to be changed or wasn't going to happen, that could just be deleted, right?
Yeah, but we would want to have something that does that, you know, or
automatically,
yeah, some sort of like job that, at least on GitLab.com, because I know that maybe self-managed, we wouldn't be able to really reach into that and clean up that data, because the risk is that
we could have an alert on the page.
Yeah.
You know, because I'd feel slightly nervous about just deleting stuff based on a. Well, we can have one way we can have is have rules where they're predefined, you know, after 30 days, but then that could be turned off or something.
Yeah, like
but
having
another way
a configuration option there.
Exactly, yeah. But another maybe simpler way would just have an alert. You have these releases, they're 30 days old. You should delete them or use them or something. You know.
Could also, if the goal is just to have upcoming releases, if that's kind of the idea is a future release, we could enforce that you have to have a release date set, and then that allows you to create a release without a tag. And then maybe if that date passes, then they don't show up on the releases page. Or I don't know. We could do something with that release date, because the idea is that these are being released in the future.
Like it could expire, you know, like expired releases. And that kind of falls in line with like our language around milestones and
I like expired actually. Yeah, because you are required to put a date in for an upcoming release. But yeah, what happens if that date passes? That's a really good question.
It expires. And if we could not show it, that would be great, because then they would have to like curl the API to make it they'd have to conduct an action, either to create a new release with a tag or, you know.
I mean, we could delete it at that point.
Yeah. Delete it if it expires. That's a good call out, Nathan.
I guess while I say that, I guess we do require a release date right now for upcoming releases. Like you can't have a null.
I'm pretty sure. I'm just looking at the docs. I'm pretty sure it's mandatory.
In order to have an upcoming release, you need to have released at attribute set.
Exactly. Thank you.
So the released at attribute is your date. Yeah. And we can't edit that in the UI. So it's a little undiscoverable right now. So that's probably why we don't see like thousands of upcoming releases. But that's like the minute that we expose that to the front end, if we choose to do that, I could see a bunch of like, again, orphan releases just being created.
Yeah.
So if we make it discoverable, people are going to use it because that's what they do, which is good. We're lucky in that regard. We just have to think of what signals can we send to them that upcoming releases are temporary. You can't have a forever upcoming release.
Yeah. The one thing I was thinking is that I can see a use case for having an upcoming release without a definite release date. I'm just thinking of like even the library we use, Vue. It's like our front end framework we use. There's another version coming out, Vue 3, and so they've been announcing it and talking about it for a long time, but there's no like set release date on it. And I could see that being kind of a common thing where we're releasing this sometime in the future, but we don't quite know when. Maybe in that case, you just pick a date and then you move it as you go on. But
yeah, Yeah, I think
That's
you
kind
would
of an
have
aside.
to. That's a good point, though. Are they incrementally delivering like fixes and stuff while they have their big date or their
They
big
are,
release?
yeah. They're still like patching bugs and stuff to the current one, and then they'll release the big one sometime in the future.
Because here's the other use case that we kind of neglect when we talk about this stuff. We often think about the SaaS world, but like a really big consumer of our product is embedded and inner sourcing. So when we look at those two use cases, they may have like a radio in an RV always consume version 3. And that version 3 will always be alive and in perpetuity because it's a perpetual license, right? People will go and consume it, download it. And they may never update version 3. So its release date will always be in the past, but it will need to be consumed because it's a published like thing that external hardware providers tag and download. There might be like firmware updates that they commit to it, but they'll always call it version 3.
Well, that's an interesting point actually, because before you said that, Jackie, I was thinking releases are progressive, right? And the latest one is the one you want, but maybe that's a different feature, right? Look, where we indicate that any of these are good. Like we support multiple. In fact, that's quite common in software, right? Like we support. There's major and minor releases, right? When you're using SemVer, and if you're not using SemVer, you just have to do it some other way, I guess.
Plus, my
we do that ourselves. Look at their security releases.
I was about to say, like my Raspberry Pi is running off of a really old GitLab version because I have a bunch of stuff with my 3D printer that it's doing. And if I break that, then my 3D printer won't work. So I have like a really old version that's still true, still being supported by GitLab, and it's still good, even though like in our world, we want people to be on the latest version, right?
Yeah.
But
but it's a supported version. Yeah.
People can still consume supported versions. I mean,
but how do we don't have a way of indicating that at the moment, right? Like a visual way.
No, but this is where we might want to create like a this archetype of a version versus a release. Like this is where the group page, if we have a release bundle, which might have a bunch of things, like this is a declared version. Right now, GitLab has milestones, which indicate versions, but nobody's calling it like, well, we call it that, but nobody says it in our documentation as like, this is a version, right? So this might be a case for creating like a declarative, like supported version, and it's a badge that's like all of these are supported versions, and maybe like there's a badge that says no longer supported or in maintenance or whatever we want to like.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. In maintenance. Yep.
So maybe that's a badge that we add supported version. That could be a new feature. But where this is going, just to restate why we went down this rabbit hole, is we're talking about expiring of releases. And if an upcoming release doesn't have a declared date or a tag on it, what to do with it. And I think that if it's an upcoming release with no tag, then it should get deleted. But if it's an upcoming release with a tag, we could just keep it, but put an alert saying that your upcoming release doesn't have, I don't know, it'll just expire, right? Like it'll no longer be an upcoming release once that date passes, right?
Because in fact, what we're using the date for is the status, right? Like it's either an upcoming release and it hasn't been
evidence
released.
collection.
Exactly, yeah.
Release stats, evidence collection,
or if the date's passed, we're assuming it's been released.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So
if you're filtering or like having a way to, if they're not being deleted, maybe we can just hide them in a separate bucket, like expired, and after some time they get deleted or they disappear because like the alerts.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that idea.
So for upcoming releases that don't have a tag, if we create this fracture, so if we break them, right? Because today all releases have a tag. So this isn't a use case in today's world, right? Because if you have to have a tag to create a release. So in the future, if we decide to fracture it, upcoming releases with no tag will expire after 30 days and get moved to expired releases. Okay. I'll create that issue. If we choose to break, like, I'm worried about this whole breaking of tags and releases. I'm worried
Me
about
too.
it. I don't know. I don't know if it's the right thing to do. I don't even know how to go about validating it. So I need to do a little more thinking around the kinds of questions we want to ask people to suggest that this fracture is necessitated.
Well, I guess a couple of questions around that, right? So, because part of the reason to do that would be this, group releases. But if we break it, so at the moment the tag is just a field on the release table, right? And it's more or less essentially used as the primary key. No, it's not actually. But if we broke it, are we saying that we can have more than one tag for a given release?
Only at the group level, like what Nathan was saying, that would be the only use case that we'd want to support.
Okay. Yeah.
The difference between a group release and a project release would be the multiple selection.
Multiple tags, yeah.
And so, I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Okay, so at the project level, we would say that, just kind of thinking out loud, so we break into two separate objects, release and tag, but each release at the project level has to have a tag, right? But then at the group level, then the release can have multiple tags.
Yeah, it needs to have at least one tag. So here's what, if I could say it a different way, it'd be, I want to duplicate exactly what the project does, but I want to be able to associate multiple tags. And
when we say multiple tags, we mean one tag per project, right?
That makes sense, but what about the use case of maybe they are continuously delivering, they create a release per deployment on their project, and they want to declare a major version. So say that they have 5 release tags in project A, and each of those are updates to different microservices or whatever, and they want to declare this is project A's monthly release, and it contains these 5 release tags.
But we could do that at the group level.
Yeah. And so I could see a world where multiple release tags exist per project, and they may want to associate multiple tags per project. But I think MVC could be the validation there is one tag per project. And then we can validate with users that multiple tags per project.
The one thing that is nice about having a single tag per project would be, like, for example, when we have those assets that we automatically download the sources. If we had, like, let's say 5 tags from one project, I don't know how, right now those are driven off the tag, like you download the code at that snapshot. So if you have 5 snapshots, suddenly, I guess you could have each version of that as a download, But
if we're associating tags from the sub-project, if we're duplicating the exact functionality, wouldn't the group asset then be all of those sub-tags?
Yeah, my thought is that you'd basically, instead of downloading one project, you download all the projects.
Right, in that
group. But it would still be one snapshot of each of those projects. It wouldn't be, let's say, 5 snapshots from one project and 5 snapshots from this other project, if you know what I mean.
Oh, this sounds complicated. That was like, oh no. I was thinking about, say that they download that asset and they want to diff those assets as a part of like an audit, right? They could be. That could be.
My thought is that if you're wanting to do different snapshots, you should have different releases. Like, that's a release kind of is a snapshot in my mind.
Yeah, but when we start to up-level it at the group level, they're saying that this is my de facto release now at this group. So each individual project's release assets should actually be like bundled and reconciled so that when they download that asset at the group level, it's the changes for all the sub-projects, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But that would be different than associating multiple tags from a single project at a
I
group
agree.
release. Yeah.
I agree. I think that our first approach should be with that validation of one project per tag. And then we can validate if multiple projects need to be, or multiple projects need to be associated per group release. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
One kind of related thought too is, I don't know if we've ever talked about associating a release to a branch instead of a tag.
I have that issue out there. I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
That could be some other way to track upcoming releases, because you could have your pre-release branch. And then the nice thing is that automatically would, like, branches move as people update them. So then your release would always point to kind of the latest version of that branch. And so that might be a way of kind of implementing upcoming without completely disconnecting releases from the source.
It's a good thought.
So if we did that, we need to, because I think we have an option where branches get deleted when we do a merge request. I think it's on, but we'd have to just disable that for those, which would be fine. I think we would just leave them out there.
Right. That's a good point.
I think the checkbox is on by default, but we can just disable the checkbox,
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there'd ever be. Yeah, I guess we'd need to handle that case regardless, but I don't think that would be a super common use case, because you wouldn't necessarily be making a merge request off a branch, like a pre-release branch. But I guess you could.
You could, yeah. And for example, say that internally a company says you need to start using our pre-release branch for every new change that you create, because that does happen for infrastructure as code, not necessarily SaaS products.
And Nathan, doesn't that pre-release then get merged, or do we pick out those? Like, how do we get that code into the trunk?
Well, that would kind of be separate. That would be managed separately, however you go about merging the branches.
Okay.
But I don't think that would affect whether or not you could point the release at the branch, is my thought.
So maybe upcoming releases actually are called release candidates or something.
Yeah.
Because then we could have a branch associated to it, a tag associated to it, potentially even a package, and maybe they're called release candidates. And then once it gets past the upcoming date, so then like the validation needs to have a tag or a branch or a package associated with it.
At the moment, there's no validation. Just once a release once the date's passed, it's a it's a release. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we might at least be careful, again, going back to naming, about release candidate, because that has kind of specific connotations. Like usually that means like, this is a release you can try out, and if it works out, we're going to release this. Whereas if it was just pointing at like a development branch or something, that would be more of the upcoming release, where it's like all the changes. It's not like necessarily a snapshot that we think we're going to release. It's just like the latest version. But we can just maybe naming can come later.
Because like larger enterprise customers call release candidate like after like it's already in test, right? And it's ready, like that whole bundle, which could be hundreds of thousands of merge requests and issues. It's like all of the changes to that production. It's a production candidate. Yeah. But this is like the difference between what a release really is versus like a version that's available for people to build off of. All these words, but you're right. You're totally right. Okay. So couple of recaps. I'll find that issue, Nathan, because I know I created it. I created it after talking with Marin over in delivery. So when I talked with him, they cut our branch on the 18th, and that's our release candidate that we then promote, right? Mm-hmm. So our current release object doesn't really support that very easily.
Right. Yep.
So that's why, yeah, I'll find that. Okay. All right. Recap. So first things first, we agree that supporting group releases makes sense. The initial MVC might be to elevate, well, one, to create like our tech evaluation for this, but then to elevate all of the project functionality of releases up to the group and add it to a side panel option and associate multiple tags per group release, one per project. Okay. And then in the future, we may decide to break tags from releases to support this idea of upcoming releases, but that's a very future thing. Sound right?
But don't we need to break tags from releases in order to have the tags, multiple tags associated with a single group release?
My thought is that we'll have to break it at a technical level, like
At a technical level, yeah.
technically we will, but from the user's point of view, you still can't create a release without any tags, with zero
Sure.
tags associated. Like at an application level, we'll enforce that you have either one for project, or at a group one or more.
Oh, okay. So from the user's perspective, they will just see the same screen with release and tag. But then when they go to the group level, they'll be able to select the tags from the subordinate projects. But internally, we have to split it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I wonder if the users will want to select like the tags or existing releases, if that would make sense. Because the way I thought it was like, okay, you have this, you're in the group level, and you can associate existing releases, and then everything that comes with that release, all the packages, the tags, the what do you call the change log, everything to the group, and you have the ability to bundle that in the group level to a new bucket package. I don't know, sorry, I'm using words and I'm like, these are two technical terms. But I was, when you mentioned now you're able to select the tag, that kind of broke my user flow. As in, would people want to select existing tags, or would they want to select existing releases with the group?
So that sounds like an artificial extra step, right? Mm-hmm. So as a user, I would need to create my project release first. And when this is automated with the YAML file, it might be negligible. But today, I would need to create my project release, and then I would need to associate that release to a group. That extra step seems completely unnecessary when they could just associate it with a group release, that tag with a group release.
Mm-hmm. So you can immediately like kind of bypass that step and say this tag and everything else that's going to come with that tag in the project level is now attached to this group release.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But go on, Sean, what were you saying?
No, I was just going to say that, releases and tags are still the same thing at the project level. So whether you choose one or the other, you still get the same thing, right? Like we're still saying that each release has to have a tag at the project level. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, but I guess the difference is the release note at the project level versus a release note at the group level.
Yeah, like you could have a group level release and have no project level releases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're different. The two, I think we've come to the conclusion that the group level release and the project level release are different, and maybe we do call it version, although I think release is fine. But then at the group level, you've got a release, and then at the project level, you've got the existing release, and at the project level, each release must equal one tag, and then at the group level, there's multiple tags or releases associated with the group level release, but aren't they the same thing effectively?
They're not the same thing, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm missing this. Is the part I'm missing.
It could be like you don't necessarily have to create a project release in order to create a group release. So in that case, they're not the same because you might be creating a new group release without creating the
Oh
project.
yeah, okay, that's a good point. So we can have tags at the project level, and then they just go up to the group level release. Okay, that's another case. Yep.
Right. So I think maybe MVC Hyana, we can support this idea of you have your project releases and you must associate them to a group release in order to take advantage of the group release functionality. But I think we'll soon discover that that's just a duplicative step that will reduce adoption of group releases. Especially if the goal is to orchestrate and plan releases across multiple things. So two questions. Should I schedule a follow-up for this, or do we feel like we can do this asynchronous? Do we feel like this was enough of a discussion for us, or is there still a bunch of like unclear direction or what we should do?
From my point of view, I think that MVC that you kind of laid out, it makes sense. And I think that'd be a good way to start.
Okay.
So I feel good about that. But I think there's lots of other things we could discuss, but I think that core MVC is a good start.
Okay, perfect. So I'll publish these notes in the Epic because I was just taking notes in a comment, and then create a couple of sub issues, and then open up a tech evaluation for this, Sean, and we can start work on that in the next milestone.
Yeah.
To either discover what it's going to take to fracture the tag from the release on the back end, even though the front end won't, or not necessarily the front end, but the user won't experience that. We can go from there.
Yeah. And in fact, because I think we have to do that, then the MVC, I don't know, maybe we don't want to bite this off, but it could include the scenario where you don't have a release at the project level and you just directly associate the tag with the group level release. I mean, I don't think it would be a big issue. But I think fracturing the two is actually going to be, it's going to be tricky, but, of course, it probably should have been done in the first place, right? When it was originally built. But once we've split them, then I think to associate them, I don't know, it depends what we want to do in the MVC. But I think that it might be actually more work to support, to not support it straight away, basically. I think it would be simpler if we're already breaking everything apart to just, let's just go all the way and have the group level release has a tag, but you can have a project that does not have a release, but it has a tag, and that tag's associated with the group level.
Yeah, that's kind of my thought. It'd be simplest to just associate selecting a tag directly, like not having to create a release in the project first.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that would actually, I don't see any issue with that.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I just submitted this. Notes are on there. I'll create some issues, and we'll work on this async. Thank you all.
One final question. We don't have to discuss this, but as we're thinking about associating project releases with group milestones, we should maybe stop to consider whether we need that if we have this concept of a group release.
We will.
Like we still will, you think?
Yeah, because of roadmap and planning functionality. It
wouldn't just make sense to create a group release at that point in time?
It could be a group release associated to a group milestone, but there may still be a need, like release CLI may still need its own project milestone. People may only consume the release CLI releases, and they may not just consume the GitLab.org release, right?
Yeah, right.
So they may, and that's just because, like, for example, Runner and release CLI, you can consume that binary independent of the GitLab binary.
Right. Yep. Okay. And then, but you'd still want to associate that project level release to the group milestone. Yeah. Okay. Because
the group milestone 13.3, we still need to get credit for that work up at that high level, from like an execution to the plan standpoint, but from a consumption of the product standpoint, it's not necessary.
I guess that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
It's the difference between a version dependency and a release almost.
Yeah.
So yeah, so and just one final clarification. So are we going to follow the tags and milestones model where we just call everything a release, and then when we need to be specific, we say, okay, this is a group level release, this is a project level release, or do we use something?
This is a naming thing that we should talk about. I think initially, let's talk about it. My gut says calling it a release at the group level may not be accurate.
Okay.
Because it may not be a production release, or it may not be like that's the moment of distribution at the group level. But let me think about it.
Yeah, because we have a different model with issues, right? When we promote an issue to an epic, it's called something else.
Right. And I could see there being value in calling it something different at the group level. Okay. Especially since everyone calls like the GitLab release a version, when I think about it.
Okay. No worries at all.
Okay. We'll talk about it. Okay. Thank you all so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.